Hey folks, how's it going? R&D Diesel. And this video today I want to take out to kind of talk about some considerations of the 7.3 Powerstroke. Some of the pros and cons of the diesel engine, and maybe you're thinking about buying one. Well, this is a good video for you to watch. Stay tuned. Hey folks, how's it going? R&D Diesel. And I wanted to get one distinction out of the way here real quick before we dive too deep into this video. That distinction is between the 7.3 Powerstroke and the 7.3 IDI. So to give you an idea, 7.3 Powerstroke and the 7.3 IDI, yes, they're both V8 diesel engines. Some of your 7.3 IDIs were also turbocharged like your Powerstroke. But other than the fact that they're both diesels and V8s, they're vastly different. To give you a little history, Ford first entered the market with their diesel engines in 1983, at least in the light-duty pickup segment with their F-250s and 350s. Now, Ford didn't really have any experience making diesels in the past, and they knew they wanted something good. So what they did was they actually partnered with International Harvester. They're a tractor company at the time, and they made lots of diesel engines, and they were experienced with it. So International came out with a 6.9-liter indirect injected, or IDI, V8 diesel engine. It was designed really to be a replacement for a lot of Ford's big block V8s. The idea at the time was that you could get big block V8 power, but hopefully get better fuel economy, because generally speaking, diesels get much better fuel economy than gasoline engines at about the same displacement. That was the idea at the time, at least. So from about 1983 until 1987, 88, they had this 6.9-liter, all-mechanical V8 diesel engine that Ford used. Now, over time, everybody wants more power. You see, those original 6.9s only had about 180 horsepower. They weren't very powerful. And they only had about 338 foot-pounds of torque. A lot of that has to do with the fact that they were naturally aspirated. They didn't have turbochargers or superchargers on them to make them any faster. So the idea at that time was, well, you've heard the old adage that there's no replacement for displacement. So in order to make just a little bit more power in 1988 era, they actually bored out those 6.9s, basically using the same block. And they bored them out so that they now displaced 7.3 liters, which is where we get 7.3. That was the first of the 7.3s that came out. Bear in mind, though, that this 7.3 IDI shared a lot of the same architecture as the 6.9. It had a mechanical fuel pump, it was indirect injected, and it still didn't really have a whole lot of power. So they produced that from 1988 until 1994, which is when the 7.3 IDI was replaced with the 7.3 Powerstroke. Again, they're very different engines. Now the thing at the time is that the old mentality with those 7.3 IDIs is that they were naturally aspirated. They had no turbochargers on them. And a lot of that was because they had a ridiculously high compression ratio. I think the IDIs had somewhere around a 22.5 to 1 compression ratio. For reference, your 7.3 Powerstroke has a 17.5 to 1 compression ratio. So, again, they're different. They're very different engines. So the idea behind the 7.3 Powerstroke, the thing that made it so revolutionary at the time, was that it used a vastly different fuel system than any of the other diesels. Back in the early 90s, and back through the entire 20th century, pretty much all your diesels were mechanically injected. They had a mechanical injection pump there, and they worked. They got the diesels done. They're very reliable, and as long as you can turn the engine over, they'll pretty much run. That's the nice thing about those mechanical pumps. Now, when the 7.3 Powerstroke came out, bear in mind, it's very different. Now, not only does the 7.3 Powerstroke have direct fuel injection, whereas the IDI only has indirect injection. If you're interested, do some more research on the differences between the IDI and the direct injection. Basic idea is that in an IDI, you have a small port over in your cylinder head where you indirectly inject the fuel, whereas your direct injected diesels have the injector placed directly over the top of your piston and directly inject the diesel into the cylinder. That's where the adage comes from. So the Powerstroke used a HUE injection system. It's a hydraulically actuated unit injector. Essentially, the idea is that the Powerstroke uses high pressure oil pump, much like your hydraulic pump. And what it does is it generates pressure up to about 3,000 psi. That pushes on a piston, which ultimately amplifies the force and puts in extremely high pressure fuel into the cylinder. That's the thing, is that the IDIs relied on relatively low injection pressures, maybe only about 3,000 psi. They didn't really need a whole lot of injection pressure, just from the nature of them. Direct injection diesels, such as the Powerstroke, needed ridiculously high injection pressures in order for them to work right and actually make power. And that's why the 7.3 Powerstroke can at times actually produce up to 21,000 psi of injection pressure. Pretty tremendous. The main thing for that is that you have better fuel atomization, that you can get finer mist of droplets when you inject the fuel. If you have too low pressure, it's just globbing diesel all over the place. It's not going to burn so great. You get tons of soot, and it's just not so good. So with that, this is where we start seeing one of the first major benefits to the 7.3 Powerstroke over, say, one of your older conventional diesels, such as maybe the mechanical 5.9 Cummins, or some of your GM diesels of the 90s as well, or some of your Ford IDIs. And that's the fact that even though it has electronic control, you may not think about that as being robust. And I'll get more onto that later. But the idea is it has something called tunability. It can actually take real-world data. What pressure do we have inside the manifold? We can use that to approximate how much airflow we're getting in. And ultimately, it allows the engine to make a lot more power, be better and more fuel efficient, and also to produce a lot less emissions. And that's what made the 7.3 Powerstroke so good. And this is where I like to think about the 7.3 Powerstroke as being kind of a middle child, if you will. I look at you as having a couple of big extremes. You've got your old school diesels that are all mechanical injected. You've got your modern diesels. I'm talking 6-liter Powerstroke onward. We're talking about 6.4, 6.6 Duramax, 6.7 Cummins, 5.9 Cummins, common rail, pretty much any of your modern diesels, if you will. Now, while these modern diesels do produce a lot of power, I mean a lot of power, and their emissions are pretty much nothing, they have their downsides. They are relatively complicated. They have tons of emissions controls on them, and yeah, they're clean, but there's a lot of stuff on them to break. Generally speaking, these modern diesels are reliable, but they're also relatively expensive, and it's not so cheap to replace fuel injectors on a common rail diesel as opposed to something older like an IDI. So if you're looking at replacing injectors, say, on a common rail, you're looking at least at $3,000, if not more, for a set of fuel injectors. Your old school mechanical diesels, like your IDIs, you can get a set of injectors on those for $300. They're dirt cheap. I mean, dirt cheap. But again, there's a trade-off. The IDIs pollute like a freight train. Well, I should say a lot worse than a freight train. Freight trains are actually not bad. Point being, they pollute a lot, and they don't make a lot of power. But your Powerstroke is kind of this, the 7.3 Powerstroke is kind of this middle in between the two. Not only is it relatively simple to where it doesn't have all these emissions controls on it, but it also has that electronic fuel injection that actually gives you that tunability. One of the popular upgrades to the 7.3 Powerstroke is that you can tune it. To give an idea as to how easy it is, you can get custom tuning for your truck that will give it more power and better fuel economy, and all you have to do is plug in, either you can plug into your OBD2 port if you've got a 96 and up truck and just reflash the PCM, or you can get something called a performance chip. You've got your Bully Dogs, you've got your TS6 position chips. What that allows you to do is you can basically put in new programming into the truck. And basically what the programming does is says, to heck with emissions, and maybe we'll take a little bit of our longevity off a little bit so we can make more power now. And that's the idea behind those, is so you can get more power. And that's something you can't exactly do with an old IDI or with a mechanical diesel. Mechanical diesels, you can do some upgrades. So a common upgrade you can do with a Cummins is that you can put in a new fuel pin. And that will sometimes give you up to 50 horsepower, but man, those things soot like nobody's business when you do it. Whereas you can tune in maybe an extra 50 horsepower into a stock 7.3, it doesn't necessarily soot all that much. It'll run great. And so that's one of the main benefits to your 7.3. Now on the downside there is, yeah, it does add some complexity. But it's not so much that it's unmanageable. The Powerstroke is, all things considered, it's still very simple. I mean, you've got a low-pressure fuel system, high pressure oil system, you've got some electronic controls, turbocharger. I mean, that's basically it. I mean, there's no emissions controls on them. That's the main thing that's nice. And all things considered, the engine bays are relatively open, relatively easy to work on, especially compared to your modern diesels. And so that's one of the nice things about them. Now, I will say this, though. If you have a stock 7.3, it's not exactly a fast truck. Bear in mind, it is still a middle child in between the new diesels and the old ones. It's not super god-awful slow. They can get out of their way, but it'll do all the work of your modern diesel, but just probably not as fast. 7.3 Powerstrokes have really robust turbochargers. They're relatively simple. They have very little moving parts. The only thing in these turbos that pretty much moves is that main shaft. Now, this is different than a lot of your modern diesels that have variable geometry turbos, where they have a bunch of these little vanes that will actually move inside the turbocharger housing. And the reason they do that is because it reduces turbo lag. If you've ever driven a stock 7.3 or just any old school turbocharged vehicle, they have this turbo lag, which is where there is a delay between you hitting the accelerator and that turbo actually spinning and making power. It's not exactly the best in the world for driving, but if you're towing, it's not really that much of a deal, because usually you're towing the load and you have that turbocharger pretty much always spooled up. Also, you'll see big trucks that are built for drag racing or what have you. They have gigantic turbos, but you wouldn't want to take those things out on the street. It wouldn't be fun at all, because those turbos are so large, they have such a massive amount of turbo lag that it would take forever for it to make any power, and it's just not a whole lot of fun. And that's where the variable geometry comes in. They give you the best of both worlds. Essentially, you can have a small turbocharger and it spools real quick, but you don't have much power at the top end. Or you can opt to have a much larger turbocharger. You have lots of top end power. It's great for towing and what have you, but it's not so great on down low. It's not really all that fun for driving around. Variable geometry turbos give you the best of both worlds. They allow you to have quick spooling turbo down low, and a big open geometry for low exhaust restriction once you get to the higher end, so you can make more power. Now, there are some other implications to variable geometry. A lot of modern diesels use them to help control EGR, exhaust gas recirculation, but if you drive a 7.3, what in the world is EGR? Don't even need to worry about it. They don't have it. And that's the thing. 7.3s, with regards to emissions controls, they don't have any, or DPF. So you look at the next generation of diesels that came after the 7.3, and you look at the 6-liter. Those things, they actually had emissions controls on them. They had the variable geometry turbos, and they also had EGR, your exhaust gas recirculation. What that does is, as the name implies, you take some exhaust gas, you put it back in the intake. What it does is it actually reduces some of your in-cylinder peak pressure or temperature, reduces your nitrous oxide emissions, and that's better for the environment. 7.3 doesn't have any of that. Only thing it has pretty much is later on your Super Duty 7.3s had some split shot injectors. The split shot helped a little bit with emissions, nitrous oxides, what have you, but largely they helped with noise. And that's the other thing. 7.3s, noise-wise, they're pretty freaking loud.